All right, this is the second lecture. This lecture will cover the history of human communication methods. Just a quick overview of what we'll cover. We'll begin by talking about how human communication has changed throughout history. Then we'll talk about basically when the fundamental changes occurred in communication abilities and what those changes mean. And we'll also talk about what makes mass media unique compared to previous forms of communication. So the stages of communication that we'll cover. We'll begin by talking about the age of speech and language. We'll then move on to the age of signs and signals. We'll talk about the age of writing, the age of print, the steam press, and then finally the age of mass communication. As you can see, the age of speech and language was the first kind of age that we dealt with within stages of communication, and then the age of mass communication is the most recent. So the age of speech and language began about 200,000 years ago when anatomically modern humans appeared. This is from the fossil record, and basically this is when humans became indistinguishable from people today. So about 200,000 years ago, cavemen existed, but this was when Homo sapiens first started to look and be basically exactly how we are today. You take a caveman from 200,000 years ago, shave him and put him in a business suit, and pretty much he looks just like everyone else that you would see. So the big difference between humans of 200,000 years ago and humans of today didn't deal with anything anatomically. They were built basically exactly the same as we are, had the same systems in the brain, had the same bodily systems, and looked exactly like us. However, they hadn't developed the technology that we have today, and language itself is a technology. So early language about 200,000 years ago was really crude, not fully developed. It probably consisted mostly of just grunts and emotionally tinged sounds so that people could tell, whether or not someone was in pain or whether or not they were okay. But it was very, very crude. Now, about 70,000 years ago in the fossil record, we start to see highly developed tools like cutting weapons appear. Now, these are the types of tools and the types of methods to create these tools are basically impossible without some form of spoken language where you can teach other people and where they can learn. So basically, language had developed about this point in time, about 70,000 years ago. It allowed for detailed transfer of information, unlike the grunts, right? So the grunts are very basic. You can't tell a lot from them. But the type of language that started to appear about 70,000 years ago was much more detailed. You could actually tell people how to do something and they could follow along. It wasn't just a series of grunts. So after language developed, we started to develop signs and signals. And this was about 32,000 years ago. We start to see proto-writing appear in the fossil record. So this is not alphabetic. This isn't even cuneiformic. So this is really, really basic kind of writing. And these are on like walls of caves, basically. So they're pictures mostly. Stories and ideas are presented in the pictures and the art. And it was very basic kinds of writing. So it wasn't developed as the language that they had at the time. But they could tell stories, right? So they could paint buffalo traveling across a plain, or they could talk about the migration of certain animals. So they had stories and ideas, and they represented those in pictures and in art. I just want to bring up a quick point right here. There's the Chauvet Cave in France, which was discovered relatively recently. It dates back to the last ice age, and this is some of the earliest human writing that people have uncovered, basically. It was untouched until recently. It was discovered in 1994. And the reason it wasn't touched by even other cave people at the time was due to the fact that there was a massive landslide. So most of the caves discovered by archaeologists have been painted over by cavemen who came after the originals. However, this is the oldest cave we've detected, and it was basically in pristine condition. What we can tell from these caves is that early man was a storyteller. He told stories, he or she. They drew paintings on walls, and it was kind of an early form of performance. So an artist would draw a painting on a wall, He would talk about it, and he would kind of perform at the same time while he's discussing it. Now, there's a documentary on Chauvet Cave in France called Cave of Forgotten Dreams. I will post a link on Angel for you to go and watch this if you'd like. Um, it's on YouTube, basically the full movie. However, I'd recommend watching it in high definition. It's a really kind of amazing documentary. Completely optional to watch, but I think you'll like it. So check out at least the YouTube video that I'm posting and see if you want to watch the full thing. So these early pictographs and these early artistic drawings basically started to develop into cuneiform and early written languages over thousands of years. The first kinds of things they developed were numbers, so they developed a way to keep tallies basically, just to count. And then they developed ways to develop, it started to develop into words basically. These were really kind of basic pictures and signs and signals and whatnot. Not fully developed alphabets, they're not fully developed languages, but they're just basic ways to convey numbers, to convey some basic so cuneiform, this is an example of cuneiform. It's basically just little lines. They mean different tallies or different kind of ideas, but they're very... Another example of these kinds of proto-writings and early writings where we start to transition into actual languages and actual written languages are Egyptian hieroglyphics. Still, you can see some of the basic artistic elements that are there. You have drawings of animals, of rivers, etc. And you can see how it's kind of this transition, this gradual transition from the paintings that we have on the wall to actual language and writing that we have today. So the age of writing began about 6,000 years ago. Writing differs from other forms of communication in that you must know the spoken language to understand the text. So if you think about even just the sentence that's on the screen right now, writing differs from other forms of communication and that you must know the spoken language to understand the text, you have to understand English to figure out what that says. Now, these earlier forms of writing that we've been talking about up to this point, like the cave drawings, for example, you wouldn't necessarily have to understand the written language of people to understand that, or to some kind of meaning from it. So it wasn't a direct correlation between the writing itself and the language that the people spoke. However, with writing, you actually have a correlation between the language that's written and the language that people speak. So you actually have to understand the language to read the information. We start to develop alphabets around the age of writing. So the Greek alphabet, the Latin alphabet, Arabic alphabet, and these are basically ways that are more advanced than other forms of communication in that you have standardized symbols to represent letters, and then you group the letters together to form the bigger idea. If you think back to the cave drawings, right, they didn't have these kind of standardized symbols that were grouped together to create bigger ideas. It was just, let me see what I can draw here. So this is more standard than signs and symbols. It's definitely more efficient when you think about if you're trying to send across a very specific idea. That's going to be really hard to do in art. It's going to be much easier to do in writing. If you think of Pictionary, for example, the game, right? It's kind of hard to get your partner to figure out what you're drawing. But if you could just write it out, it would be very easy to get that idea across. So this was more standard than signs and symbols. But still developments happened over time, and I'm going to give you guys a quick example of that looking at mathematics. So if we think about mathematics, early number systems are not very efficient. So the Roman numerals were not very wieldy when it came to mathematics and even doing basic math. Romans were particularly bad at actually basic math. So if you look at the Roman numerals here, right, I means 1. If you have 2 I's in a row, that's 2. If you have 3 I's in a row, that's 3. Basically, V makes 5. And then you can say what 4 is based on V, right? 1 before V equals 1 before 5, which equals 4. A 1 after a V equals 1 after 5, which equals 6. VII equals 2 after 5, which equals 7. So you can see it's not as well developed as what we have today when we look at Arabic numerals. And then the other big thing to think about with Roman numerals is they didn't even have a zero, so they didn't have a placeholding ability that we have today with other forms of numbers. So the Romans didn't have a very advanced mathematics. They were particularly bad at math. They didn't have a zero, so when you look at the calendar, it goes from 1 BC to 1 AD. There's no year zero. So they're kind of limited in their mathematics, even though they had a more developed writing style. So let's try math. So if we have 2 plus 7, what does that equal? Does it equal VIII? Well, not really. It equals 9, which is represented in a different format, right? So IX. Now, if you look at this, there's no way to get to IX from the numerals that we have, right? We have 2 and 7, and it's kind of confusing. Why does that equal IX? It's not very clear. Now, if we look at the advancement that occurred, it happened about 1,000 years ago with development of Arabic numerals. And so 2 plus 7 equals 9. We all know that. And it's hard to see how that's any better than this right now, but just follow me for a second. The Arabic numerals also had the invention of 0, which allows for placeholders, right? So you have your ones column, you have your tens column, you have your hundreds column, your thousands column, etc. So if we did math like this, right, 10 plus 2, you can see that it's very easy to figure out how that follows together, right? So you've got 0 ones plus 2 ones, that equals 2, and you've got 1 10 plus 0 tens, which equals 1 10, so that's 1 10 and 2. You can just call it 12, but you can see how 0 allows for a little bit easier calculations than this kind of Roman math up here, right? So even if you had 10 plus x, it's kind of hard to figure that out as well. With the invention of Arabic numerals, you also had the advancement of other mathematics. So algebra didn't exist before Arabic numerals. And calculus, needless to say, didn't exist without Arabic numerals. So all of these advancements that we've been talking about, right, moving from signs and signals to moving to written alphabets, they're allowing for unique human communication skills to develop.